Picture this. You're sitting in a lawyer's office, surrounded by people who've spent years treating you like dirt, and they just read out loud that your beloved uncle left you exactly $3. $3 while everyone else gets thousands. The room erupts in cruel laughter, calling you pathetic for even showing up. But what they don't know is that those 3 crumpled bills are about to become the key to a $127 million empire that will flip their world upside down forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Morning, the February wind in Denver cut through my wool coat, like it had a personal vendetta against anyone foolish enough to be outside. I sat in my Honda Civic, engine running to keep the heater going, staring up at the gleaming glass tower that housed Mitchell and Associates. The building seemed to stretch endlessly into the gray morning sky, all sharp angles and reflective surfaces that made everything look colder than it already was. My name is Emma Carter, and at 24, I'd already learned that life has a twisted sense of humor. 3 weeks ago, I was just another college graduate working 2 part-time jobs to make ends meet, tutoring kids in math during the day and waiting tables at Murphy's Diner on weekends. I lived in a tiny studio apartment where the radiator clanked all night and the neighbor's dog barked at shadows. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, and I was proud of every small step I'd taken to build something resembling a stable life. Then Frank Morrison died, and everything changed. Frank wasn't technically my uncle. He wasn't technically anything to me, according to the state of Colorado, or any legal document you could find. But blood doesn't always make family, and Frank had been more of a father to me than anyone else ever was or ever could be. When my parents died in that horrific pileup on I-25 12 years ago, when I was just a scared 12-year-old girl with nowhere to go and no one who wanted me, Frank stepped up. He wasn't obligated to. He wasn't even a close family friend. My dad had worked construction for one of Frank's companies, Morrison Industries, and Frank had met me exactly twice before my parents died. But something about seeing a kid lost in the system moved him. He couldn't adopt me officially. The social workers explained that his bachelor status and demanding work schedule made him an unlikely candidate. But Frank found ways around the system. He paid for the private foster home that actually cared about their kids. He showed up to every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every soccer game where I sat on the bench more often than I played. When other kids were getting picked up by tired-looking parents in minivans, Frank would arrive in his old pickup truck, windows down, classic rock playing on the radio, grinning like spending his Saturday afternoon watching 12-year-olds kick a ball around was the highlight of his week. Throughout high school, Frank became my constant. He taught me how to drive in that same pickup truck, letting me practice parallel parking in empty mall parking lots on Sunday mornings. When I struggled with algebra, he sat at my kitchen table for hours, working through problems with the patience of a saint. When I got accepted to Colorado State University, Frank cried harder than I did. When I worried about tuition costs, he waved his hand dismissively and said education was the one thing nobody could ever take away from me. Frank Morrison built Morrison Industries from absolutely nothing. He started with a single construction crew and a dream of creating buildings that wouldn't just stand up, but would stand for something. By the time I knew him, his company specialized in sustainable construction materials, green building techniques, and environmental consulting. Frank was passionate about leaving the world better than he found it, and he poured that passion into every project, every client meeting, every decision he made. But Frank never talked about money, never flaunted his success. He drove that same pickup truck for 15 years. He lived in a modest ranch house in a middle-class neighborhood. He shopped at the same grocery store as everyone else, and knew the checkout clerks by name. You'd never guess that this soft-spoken man in flannel shirts and work boots was worth more than most people see in several lifetimes. 3 weeks ago, Frank had a massive heart attack while reviewing blueprints in his home office. The paramedics said it was quick, that he probably didn't suffer. The funeral was packed with employees, contractors, community leaders, and dozens of people I'd never met who all had stories about how Frank had helped them somehow. It was beautiful, and heartbreaking, and overwhelming. What wasn't beautiful was how Frank's biological family treated me throughout the entire process. Carol Morrison Hayes was Frank's older sister. a woman who'd spent the last 20 years perfecting the art of looking perpetually disappointed with everyone around her. She lived in Cherry Hills Village, Denver's most exclusive neighborhood, in a house that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. Carol had married a successful orthodontist, Dr. Richard Hayes, and they'd produced 2 sons who seemed to have inherited their mother's talent for looking down on people. David Morrison was 32, a failed real estate developer who'd blown through 3 different business ventures and was currently working as a sales associate at a luxury car dealership. His younger brother, Ryan, was 29 and worked in marketing for a tech startup that specialized in social media consulting for small businesses. Neither of them had ever shown much interest in Frank until they realized he might be worth something. At Frank's funeral, Carol, David, and Ryan formed their own little exclusive club. They sat in the front row like they owned the place, accepting condolences from Frank's friends and business associates like they were the primary mourners. When people approached me to share memories of Frank, Carol would appear beside me with a tight smile and redirect the conversation back to herself. "Yes, Frank was such a wonderful brother," she'd say, emphasizing the word brother like it carried special significance. "We were so close growing up. He always looked up to me for guidance." This was news to me. In all the years I'd known Frank, he'd mentioned Carol maybe a dozen times, and never with particular warmth. He'd told me once that Carol disapproved of his choice to help me, that she thought he was wasting money that should stay in the family. Frank had laughed when he told me this, shaking his head like he couldn't believe someone could think so small. David and Ryan were even more obvious in their dismissal of me. During the reception after the funeral, I overheard David talking to a group of Frank's business associates. "Yeah, Uncle Frank always had a soft spot for strays," David said, loud enough for me to hear from across the room. "He never could resist a sob story. Threw money at every sad case that crossed his path." Ryan nodded along eagerly. Mom always warned him about people taking advantage of his generosity, but Frank was too trusting for his own good. The clear implication was that I was one of those strays, one of those sad cases, someone who'd manipulated Frank's kindness for my own benefit. It stung more than I wanted to admit, especially coming so soon after losing the most important person in my life. But the worst moment came when I was standing by Frank's casket during the final viewing. I'd brought a small photo of Frank and me from my high school graduation, where he's grinning proudly with his arm around my shoulders. I wanted to leave it with him, a small token of all the memories we'd shared. Carol appeared beside me like a ghost, her voice low and venomous. "I don't know why you're even here, Emma. Frank was our blood, not yours. This grief you're performing, it's inappropriate. You're not family, and you never were." I turned to look at her. This woman who'd barely spoken to her brother in the months before he died, who'd missed his birthday because she was vacationing in Aspen, who'd declined his Christmas dinner invitation because she had prior commitments. I wanted to tell her about all the times Frank had called me just to check in, all the Sunday afternoon conversations we'd had about everything and nothing, all the ways he'd been more present in my life than she'd ever been in his. Instead, I placed the photo gently beside Frank's folded hands and walked away. Some battles aren't worth fighting, especially when the person you're defending can't speak for themselves anymore. So when the letter from Mitchell and Associates arrived in my mailbox a few days later, informing me that I was named in Frank's will and requesting my presence at the reading, I was genuinely shocked. I'd never expected Frank to leave me anything. He'd already given me so much over the years: my education, my confidence, my sense of self-worth. The idea that he might have left me some small keepsake, maybe his old chess set or his collection of vintage tools, was both touching and overwhelming. I'd called the law office to confirm that my invitation wasn't some kind of mistake. The receptionist, a kind-sounding woman named Mrs. Patterson, assured me that I was indeed expected at the will reading scheduled for Friday morning at 10 o'clock. "Will there be many people there?" I'd asked, dreading the thought of facing Carol and her sons again so soon. "Just immediate family members named in the will," Mrs. Patterson had replied. "Mr. Mitchell keeps these proceedings quite intimate and respectful." Immediate family. The phrase echoed in my head for days. Frank had considered me immediate family, at least enough to include me in his final wishes. It was a small comfort, during a time when I felt completely alone in the world. Now, sitting in my car outside the law office, I watched as familiar figures emerged from expensive vehicles. Carol stepped out of a black Mercedes, dressed in what was probably a designer suit that cost more than I made in 2 months. She moved with the confident stride of someone who expected the world to arrange itself according to her preferences. David pulled up in a gleaming BMW, the kind of car that screamed, "I need you to know I'm successful," to everyone within a mile radius. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit that looked like it had been tailored specifically for him, and his hair was styled with the kind of precision that only comes from expensive salon visits. Ryan arrived last in an Audi convertible that seemed impractical for February in Colorado, but probably made him feel important. He was dressed similarly to his brother, all sharp lines and carefully coordinated accessories. Both brothers had inherited their mother's talent for looking like they belonged in any high-end establishment. I looked down at my own outfit, a simple black dress I'd bought at Target and a coat I'd found at a thrift store. My shoes were comfortable flats that had seen better days, and my purse was a practical crossbody bag that held my entire life but wouldn't impress anyone. The contrast between my appearance and theirs felt like a statement about our respective places in Frank's world. But Frank had never cared about appearances. He'd cared about character, about kindness, about showing up for people when they needed you. I reminded myself of this as I gathered my courage and stepped out into the bitter morning air. The walk from my car to the building entrance felt like miles. With each step, I could feel Carol, David, and Ryan watching me, probably wondering why I had the audacity to show up to what they clearly considered their private family business. I kept my eyes forward and my shoulders straight, channeling every lesson Frank had ever taught me about dignity and grace under pressure. As I approached the glass doors, David called out to me with fake cheerfulness. Well, look who decided to show up. Emma Carter, Frank's little charity case." Ryan laughed like his brother had just delivered the wittiest joke ever told. "I'm surprised you can afford parking downtown. This area gets pretty expensive." Carol's approach was more subtle, but no less cutting. She looked me up and down with the kind of assessment usually reserved for livestock auctions. "I'm honestly surprised you have the nerve to be here, Emma. This is family business. And despite what Frank may have led you to believe, you're not family." The words hit their intended target, but I'd had 3 weeks to prepare for this moment. Frank had taught me that people's cruelty often revealed more about them than about their targets. These people were afraid of something, threatened by my presence in a way that didn't quite make sense yet. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I received an invitation from Mr. Mitchell's office," I said quietly, not rising to their bait. "I'm here because Frank wanted me to be here." Carol's expression darkened. Frank had a soft heart and poor judgment when it came to strays. Don't mistake his misplaced kindness for any kind of real affection or obligation. David stepped closer, clearly enjoying the opportunity to intimidate someone he perceived as powerless. "Look, Emma, let's be honest here. Whatever Frank might have left you, it's probably some sentimental nonsense. A book, maybe, or some old photographs. Don't get your hopes up for anything substantial. The real assets, the important stuff, that stays in the family. The actual family." Ryan nodded vigorously. "Mom's right. Frank understood bloodlines and legacy. He built Morrison Industries for the Morrison name, not for random people he felt sorry for." I wanted to tell them that Frank had never once made me feel like charity, that he'd treated me with more genuine love and respect than they'd probably ever shown him. I wanted to explain that Frank had valued loyalty and character over bloodlines, that he'd been disappointed by their years of neglect and indifference. But I also knew that nothing I said would change their minds or their behavior. Instead, I simply walked past them into the building, holding my head high and refusing to let their words diminish the love and respect Frank had shown me over the years. Whatever happened in that lawyer's office, I was there because Frank Morrison had wanted me there, and that was enough. The lobby of Mitchell and Associates was all marble floors and expensive artwork, The kind of place designed to remind visitors that serious money was handled here. A receptionist directed me to the 15th floor, where Mr. James Mitchell's office overlooked downtown Denver through floor-to-ceiling windows. As the elevator rose, I thought about Frank and all the lessons he'd taught me over the years. About integrity, about standing up for what's right, about treating people with dignity regardless of their circumstances, about building something meaningful rather than just accumulating wealth, about leaving the world better than you found it. Whatever Frank had left me in his will, I knew it came with love and careful consideration. He'd never done anything without a purpose, and I trusted that his final act would be no different. In just a few minutes, I'd learn what Frank Morrison's last gift to me would be. I had no idea I was about to inherit an empire. The conference room at Mitchell & Associates felt like entering a cathedral of wealth and power. Dark mahogany panels lined the walls, broken only by tall windows that offered a panoramic view of downtown Denver stretching toward the Rocky Mountains. The massive oval table in the center could have seated 20 people comfortably, but today only 5 chairs were occupied, creating an atmosphere of intimate formality that somehow made everything feel more significant. I took my seat across from Carol, David, and Ryan, who had arranged themselves like a united front preparing for battle. Their positioning wasn't accidental. Carol sat in the center, flanked by her sons, all 3 of them leaning slightly forward with the predatory focus of people who were about to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. Their expensive clothing and perfectly groomed appearances seemed to gleam under the soft lighting, making them look like they belonged in this rarefied environment of legal proceedings and family fortunes. In contrast, I felt like an imposter in my simple black dress and modest jewelry. My hands were folded in my lap to keep them from shaking, and I found myself studying the grain of the mahogany table to avoid making eye contact with Frank's family. The silence in the room was heavy with expectation and barely concealed hostility, broken only by the muffled sounds of downtown traffic filtering through the windows 15 floors below. Mr. James Mitchell entered the room with the measured pace of someone who had conducted countless similar meetings over the decades. He was a distinguished man in his mid-60s, with silver hair that was still thick and wavy, and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that suggested he'd seen enough family drama to remain professionally compassionate but emotionally detached. His charcoal suit was impeccably tailored but understated, projecting competence without ostentation. He carried a thick manila folder that seemed to contain the weight of Frank's entire life, along with a smaller sealed envelope that he placed carefully beside the folder. The sight of that envelope made my stomach flutter with nervous anticipation, though I couldn't have explained why. Something about the deliberate way Mr. Mitchell handled it suggested it contained something important, something that would matter in ways I couldn't yet imagine. "Good morning, everyone," Mr. Mitchell said, settling into his chair at the head of the table. His voice was warm but professional, striking the perfect balance between solemnity and efficiency. "Thank you all for being here today. I know this is a difficult time for Frank's family, and I want to assure you that we'll handle this proceeding with the dignity and respect that Mr. Morrison deserves." Carol nodded regally, as if she were granting permission for the meeting to continue. "We appreciate your sensitivity, Mr. Mitchell. Frank spoke of you often over the years. He trusted your judgment implicitly. This was news to me. In all my conversations with Frank, he'd mentioned his lawyer perhaps twice, both times in passing. But Carol spoke with the authority of someone who'd been privy to Frank's most intimate thoughts and decisions, which seemed unlikely given how rarely she'd actually spoken to her brother in recent years." David cleared his throat meaningfully. "We're all eager to understand Frank's final wishes and to honor his legacy appropriately. I think I speak for the family when I say we're prepared to handle whatever responsibilities he's entrusted to us." Ryan nodded enthusiastically. "Uncle Frank always said the Morrison name meant something in this city. We want to make sure his life's work continues in the right hands." I remained silent, partly because I didn't trust my voice not to crack, and partly because I had nothing to prove to these people. Frank's opinion was the only one that had ever mattered to me, and Frank was gone. Whatever he'd chosen to leave me, I would treasure it, not for its monetary value, but for what it represented about our relationship and his faith in me. Mr. Mitchell opened the manila folder with careful precision, revealing several official-looking documents topped with the formal heading, "Last Will and Testament of Franklin James Morrison." The sight of Frank's name in bold lettering made my throat tighten with fresh grief. Even 3 weeks after his death, seeing his name on legal documents felt surreal, like encountering evidence of someone who couldn't possibly be gone. "Before we begin with the specific bequests," Mr. Mitchell said, adjusting his glasses and scanning the top document, "I want to read Mr. Morrison's opening statement, which he insisted be included in its entirety." He cleared his throat and began to read in Frank's voice, or at least the formal version of it that emerged through legal language and careful consideration. "I, Franklin James Morrison, being of sound mind and body, write this will with full knowledge of my mortality and complete confidence. I have lived a blessed life, filled with work that mattered, and relationships that sustained me. I have been fortunate to build a business that creates value beyond profit, and to touch lives that have enriched mine in return." The words sounded like Frank, even filtered through legal formality. I could hear his voice in the emphasis on work that mattered, and relationships that sustained him. Frank had always believed that success without meaning was just sophisticated failure, and he'd built his entire life around the principle that what you leave behind matters more than what you accumulate along the way. Mr. Mitchell continued reading. "I hope that my final wishes will be understood not as judgment, but as recognition. I have observed the people in my life carefully over many years, and I leave my worldly possessions to those who have demonstrated the qualities I most admire: loyalty, integrity, genuine affection, and the understanding that family is defined by actions rather than blood." Carol's smile flickered slightly at the phrase, "actions rather than blood," but she quickly recovered her composure. David and Ryan exchanged a glance that suggested they were processing the implications of Frank's words but weren't yet concerned. After all, they were blood relatives, and surely Frank's philosophical musings wouldn't override biological reality when it came to actual inheritance decisions. "Now," Mr. Mitchell said, turning to a new page, "let's proceed with the specific bequests, listed in the order Mr. Morrison requested." The formal reading began with smaller items and monetary gifts to Frank's employees and longtime friends. His secretary of 15 years received a year's salary and a heartfelt note thanking her for her dedication. His construction foreman got Frank's collection of vintage tools along with $5,000. Several longtime employees received modest but meaningful gifts that clearly reflected Frank's personal knowledge of their circumstances and needs. As Mr. Mitchell worked through this list, I found myself smiling despite my nerves. This was so typical of Frank, thinking about everyone who had contributed to his life and making sure they knew they were valued. He'd always been generous with his time and resources, but never in a showy way. His generosity was quiet and personal, focused on what would actually help people rather than what would make him look good. Carol, David, and Ryan listened to this portion with polite but visible impatience. These smaller bequests were clearly just preliminaries to them, appetizers before the main course of serious family inheritance. They sat with the forced attention of people waiting for their names to be called at an awards ceremony, confident that their moment of recognition was coming. Finally, Mr. Mitchell reached what appeared to be the main section of the will. "Now we come to the primary bequests to family members," he announced, and the energy in the room shifted palpably. Carol straightened in her chair, David leaned forward expectantly, and Ryan actually rubbed his hands together in anticipation. "To my sister, Carol Morrison Hayes," Mr. Mitchell read, "I leave my collection of antique pocket watches, which belonged to our father and his father before him, along with the sum of $10,000. Carol's smile was radiant. How thoughtful of Frank to remember the family heirlooms. Those watches have such sentimental value. The fact that she focused on sentiment rather than monetary value was interesting, especially since I happen to know that Frank's watch collection was worth considerably more than $10,000. But Carol seemed genuinely pleased, nodding approvingly, as if Frank had made exactly the right choice. "To my nephew David Morrison," Mr. Mitchell continued, "I leave my collection of classic automobiles, currently housed in the garage facility on Blake Street, along with $15,000. David's grin was triumphant. "Uncle Frank always knew I appreciated fine cars. That collection must be worth a fortune." Again, I had to suppress a reaction. Frank's car collection consisted of exactly 3 vehicles: his beloved pickup truck, a 1967 Mustang that needed significant restoration work, and a vintage Volkswagen van that Frank had bought on a whim and barely ever drove. David was clearly imagining something far more extensive and valuable than reality would provide. To my nephew Ryan Morrison, Mr. Mitchell read, "I leave my coin collection, currently stored in the safe deposit box at First National Bank, along with $15,000. Ryan looked equally pleased. Frank always said I had a good eye for valuable things. I can't wait to see what treasures he collected over the years. I bit my lip to keep from reacting. Frank's coin collection was a hobby he'd picked up late in life, consisting mainly of interesting coins he'd found in his travels rather than any systematic accumulation of valuable pieces. He'd enjoyed the stories behind the coins more than their potential worth, and had once told me that the entire collection was probably worth less than $100 in actual monetary terms. The pattern was becoming clear. Frank had given each of his blood relatives exactly what they expected to receive, but not necessarily what they thought they were getting. Their assumptions about the value of their inheritances seemed to be based more on wishful thinking than actual knowledge of Frank's possessions. Then Mr. Mitchell's voice took on a slightly different tone, more careful and precise. "And to Emma Carter," he said, looking directly at me across the table, "I leave the sum of $3. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt like I'd been slapped across the face. Not because of the amount, but because of how it sounded in that formal setting, surrounded by Frank's family, who had just received thousands of dollars and valuable collections. $3. Not 3,000, not 30, $3 The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before David began to laugh. Not a polite chuckle or a surprised giggle, but a full-throated laugh that echoed off the mahogany walls and seemed to fill every corner of the room. $3? He gasped between bursts of laughter. "Did I hear that correctly? $3 whole?" Ryan joined in immediately, slapping his knee like he'd never heard anything so hilarious. "Oh, that's rich! That's absolutely perfect!" Uncle Frank had quite the sense of humor after all. Carol's reaction was more controlled but equally cutting. She shook her head slowly with the kind of disappointed expression usually reserved for children who had misbehaved in public. "Honestly, Emma, isn't this embarrassing? I mean, $3. Don't spend it all in one place." The cruelty in her voice was breathtaking. This woman was actually taking pleasure in what she saw as my humiliation, savoring the moment like fine wine. Her sons continued to laugh, feeding off each other's amusement and their mother's approval. "I guess we know where you ranked in Uncle Frank's affections," David said, wiping tears from his eyes. $3. That's what, enough for a cup of coffee? Maybe a candy bar? Actually," Ryan added with mock helpfulness, "with inflation these days, $3 might not even cover a decent coffee. You might have to settle for vending machine soda." Their laughter continued, growing louder and more vicious with each exchange. I sat frozen in my chair, feeling heat rise in my cheeks and my hands clench involuntarily in my lap. This wasn't just about the money. This was about their perception that Frank had finally put me in my place, had demonstrated once and for all that I was nothing more than a charity case who'd overstayed her welcome. But something felt wrong about the whole situation. Frank had never been cruel, never been petty, never been the kind of person who would use his final will to deliver insults or teach harsh lessons. The man who had patiently helped me with algebra homework and celebrated every small milestone in my life wouldn't have left me $3 as some kind of pointed statement about my worth. As Carol, David, and Ryan continued their performance of amusement and superiority, I found myself studying Mr. Mitchell's face. He wasn't laughing. In fact, he looked distinctly uncomfortable with their reaction, his kind eyes flickering between them and me with something that looked almost like anticipation. And then I noticed that he kept glancing at that sealed envelope he'd placed beside the main will documents. The envelope that seemed to be waiting for something, some cue or signal that hadn't come yet. "Emma," Carol said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "I hope you understand now why we tried to spare you this embarrassment." Frank obviously wanted to make a point about the difference between charity and family. $3 is quite generous, really, when you think about it as payment for all those years of playing at being his niece. David nodded sagely. "It's actually a lesson about knowing your place. Uncle Frank was always big on teaching responsibility and realistic expectations." Ryan couldn't resist adding his own interpretation. Maybe it's meant to be symbolic. Like, here's enough money to buy yourself a clue about where you actually stand in this family. Their words stung, but underneath the humiliation, I felt something else stirring. Anger, yes, but also confusion, and a growing suspicion that I was missing something important. Frank hadn't raised me to be entitled or grasping, but he also hadn't raised me to accept insults quietly when I knew they were wrong. I accept the bequest, I said quietly, my voice cutting through their laughter like a blade through silk. The room went silent again, but this time the quality of the silence was different, charged, expectant. Mr. Mitchell's eyebrows rose slightly, and he reached for the sealed envelope with what looked like relief. Miss Carter, you've heard your bequest as outlined in Mr. Morrison's will. Do you accept the $3 left to you without complaint or contest? There was something in his tone, some emphasis on the word without, that made me look at him more carefully. His eyes held mine steadily, and I had the strangest sensation that this was some kind of test, some crucial moment that would determine what happened next. Yes, I said clearly, my voice stronger now. I accept Mr. Morrison's gift exactly as he intended it. Carol looked irritated by my dignified response. Well, at least you're not making a scene about it. Though I have to say, showing up here for $3 seems rather grasping. Actually, Mr. Mitchell said, and his tone carried a note of quiet authority that made everyone in the room pay attention. There's more. David's laughter died abruptly. More what? More to Mr. Morrison's will, Mr. Mitchell replied, holding up the sealed envelope. This is a codicil to the will, properly witnessed and notarized, with specific instructions about when it should be opened and read. Carol's face had gone very still. What kind of instructions? Mr. Mitchell looked directly at me as he broke the seal on the envelope. Mr. Morrison specified that this portion of his will should only be read if Miss Carter accepted her initial bequest with grace and dignity, without complaint or demand for more. The color drained from Carol's face. David and Ryan exchanged alarmed glances, their earlier amusement completely evaporated. That seems unnecessarily complicated, Carol said, her voice tight with sudden anxiety. Frank was always prone to dramatic gestures. Mr. Mitchell unfolded the documents from the envelope with ceremonial care. Actually, Mrs. Hayes, Mr. Morrison was quite specific about his reasoning. He wanted to ensure that this inheritance went to someone who valued his memory more than his money. Ryan leaned forward urgently. What inheritance? What are you talking about? Mr. Mitchell adjusted his glasses and began to read from the codicil, in the same measured tone he'd used for the rest of the will. But somehow the words seemed to carry more weight now, more consequence. This codicil supersedes and nullifies all previous bequests except the $3 to Miss Emma Carter, which was a test of character rather than a final gift. The room had gone so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Carol's breathing seemed to have stopped entirely. If Miss Carter has accepted her modest bequest with grace, as I believed she would, then this codicil takes immediate effect, and the following represents my true final wishes. Mr. Mitchell paused, looking around the room at faces that had gone from triumphant to terrified in the space of 30 seconds. I hereby bequeath the entirety of Morrison Industries, including all subsidiary companies, real estate holdings, business assets, and personal property not otherwise specified, to Miss Emma Carter, in recognition of her loyalty, integrity, and genuine affection. The silence that followed was absolute and devastating. Carol looked like she'd been turned to stone. David's mouth was hanging open in a way that would have been comical under different circumstances. Ryan had gone so pale I worried he might actually faint. The current estimated value of these assets, Mr. Mitchell continued relentlessly, is approximately $127 million. And that's when Carol Morrison Hayes began to scream. Carol's scream pierced through the mahogany-paneled conference room like a fire alarm in a library. It wasn't the kind of scream you hear in movies, theatrical and controlled. This was raw, primal, the sound of someone whose entire world had just collapsed in the span of 30 seconds. Her perfectly composed facade shattered completely, revealing something wild and desperate underneath all that designer polish. "No!" she shrieked, shooting to her feet so violently that her chair rolled backward and crashed into the credenza behind her. This is impossible. This is fraud. Frank would never. He couldn't. He wouldn't do this to his own family. Her face had gone from pale to bright red, then to an alarming shade of purple. The carefully applied makeup that had looked so perfect an hour ago was now streaked with tears of rage and disbelief. Her hands shook as she grabbed the edge of the conference table, knuckles white with the force of her grip. David looked like he'd been hit by a truck. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly without producing any sound, like a fish gasping on dry land. The confidence and arrogance that had radiated from him earlier had evaporated completely, leaving behind a man who suddenly looked much younger and far less certain about his place in the world. Ryan had gone completely white, so pale that the freckles across his nose stood out like paint spatters. He kept blinking rapidly, as if he could somehow change what he'd just heard by clearing his vision. His breathing had become shallow and quick, and I genuinely worried he might hyperventilate. This can't be legal, David finally managed to gasp. Uncle Frank was sick. He was manipulated. He wasn't thinking clearly. You can't just change your will like this, especially not to leave everything to some random person who isn't even family. Mr. Mitchell remained completely calm in the face of their hysteria, his voice steady and professional. I can assure you, Mr. Morrison, that your uncle was of completely sound mind when he executed both the original will and this codicil. I have detailed medical documentation to that effect, including a psychological evaluation conducted specifically for this purpose. Carol whirled on him, her eyes blazing with fury. You helped him do this. You manipulated a grieving, sick old man into making insane decisions. I'll have you disbarred for this. I'll sue you for malpractice, for fraud, for everything I can think of. Mrs. Hayes, Mr. Mitchell replied with infinite patience. I understand you're upset, but I must advise you to be very careful about making accusations you cannot substantiate. Mr. Morrison came to me with these changes entirely of his own volition, and he was quite specific about his reasoning. David finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak. What reasoning? What possible reason could Uncle Frank have for giving everything to her instead of his own flesh and blood? For the first time since this revelation began, Mr. Mitchell looked directly at me. There was something in his expression that might have been approval, or perhaps sympathy for what he knew was coming next. Actually, he said. Mr. Morrison left a detailed explanation of his decision. Would you like me to read it? Yes, Carol snapped. I want to hear every word of whatever nonsense Frank wrote. I want to know exactly how this gold-digging little manipulator convinced him to betray his own family. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. I'd been sitting in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened, but hearing Carol call me a gold digger and a manipulator after everything Frank and I had shared over the years ignited something fierce inside me. I never asked Frank for anything, I said quietly, my voice cutting through their chaos. Not once. In all the years I knew him. Carol turned her fury on me, her face twisted with hatred. Oh, please. You don't seriously expect us to believe that. You worked on him for years, playing the poor little orphan, making him feel sorry for you. You probably convinced him that we didn't care about him, turned him against his own family. When did you last call Frank? I asked, my voice still quiet but gaining strength. When did you last visit him without asking for something? Carol's mouth snapped shut, but David jumped to her defense. That's not the point. Uncle Frank was our blood. He had responsibilities to his family, to the Morrison name, to the legacy he built. The legacy he built with his own hands, I replied, while working 16-hour days and never asking any of you for help or support. Ryan had finally found his voice, though it came out high and strained. This is insane. You can't just steal someone's inheritance because you told some sob stories and played up to a lonely old man. The characterization of Frank as a lonely old man manipulated by sob stories made my temper flare completely. Frank Morrison had been one of the sharpest, most principled people I'd ever known. The idea that he could be manipulated by anyone, let alone by me, was both insulting and absurd. Frank wasn't lonely, I said, standing up for the first time since entering the room. He was surrounded by people who genuinely cared about him. His employees adored him. His friends respected him. His community valued him. The only people who treated him like he was disposable were sitting at this table. Carol's eyes blazed with renewed fury. How dare you? Frank was my brother. I loved him more than some random stranger ever could. Really? I asked. When was the last time you told him that? When was the last time you spent time with him, without asking for money, or favors, or connections for your sons? The silence that followed was damning. Carol's mouth worked soundlessly, searching for an answer that didn't exist. Mr. Mitchell cleared his throat gently. Perhaps it would be helpful to read Mr. Morrison's explanation. He was quite thorough in documenting his reasoning. He pulled out several handwritten pages from the envelope, and I recognized Frank's distinctive penmanship immediately. Seeing his handwriting made my throat tighten with fresh grief, but also with something like pride. Frank had taken the time to explain his decision carefully, to make sure his reasoning would be understood. This is a personal letter from Mr. Morrison, Mr. Mitchell began, written in his own hand and properly witnessed. It reads as follows. His voice took on a slightly different quality as he began to read Frank's actual words, as if he understood the weight they carried. To whoever is reading this letter, I want to be very clear about my decision to leave my life's work to Emma Carter, rather than to my biological relatives. This choice was not made in anger or spite, but after years of careful observation and consideration. Carol made a strangled sound of protest, but Mr. Mitchell continued reading without pause. Emma came into my life when she was 12 years old and had lost everything. She was frightened, alone, and facing an uncertain future in the foster care system. I stepped in not because I had to, but because I recognized something special in this young girl. She was resilient, kind, intelligent, and determined to make something of herself despite her circumstances. My eyes filled with tears as Frank's voice seemed to speak directly to me through Mr. Mitchell's careful reading. Over the past 12 years, I have watched Emma grow into an extraordinary young woman. She has worked hard for everything she's achieved. She has never asked me for anything beyond what was necessary for her education and basic needs. She has shown me genuine affection and respect, not because of what I could give her, but because she valued our relationship. David interrupted with a harsh laugh. Of course she valued your relationship. You were paying for everything. Mr. Mitchell paused and looked at him with mild disapproval. Mr. Morrison anticipated that reaction. He addresses it specifically in the next paragraph. He continued reading. I know some people will say that Emma only cared about me because of my financial support. This shows a fundamental misunderstanding of her character. Emma visited me regularly, even after she graduated from college and was financially independent. She called to check on me when she was struggling to pay her own bills. She remembered my birthday when my own sister forgot. She asked about my health, my work, my dreams. Not because she wanted something from me, but because she genuinely cared about my well-being. Carol's face was getting redder by the minute. This is ridiculous. Frank was obviously manipulated into writing this nonsense. Furthermore, Mr. Mitchell continued, I have observed the behavior of my blood relatives over the same 12-year period. My sister Carol has contacted me primarily when she needed financial assistance or social connections. She has missed family gatherings when they conflicted with her social calendar. She has criticized my choices and relationships without offering support or understanding. Carol shot to her feet again. That's not true. I loved Frank. I was always there for him. My nephews David and Ryan, the letter continued, have shown even less interest in maintaining a genuine relationship. They have asked for loans, business connections, and introductions to potential clients, but they have rarely inquired about my personal life or well-being. They have declined dinner invitations, skipped holiday celebrations, and treated me more like a bank than a family member. David and Ryan exchanged guilty glances, but David rallied quickly. Uncle Frank was a busy man. We didn't want to bother him with trivial social visits. Yet Emma never found my company trivial, Mr. Mitchell read. She understood that relationships require investment of time and attention, not just appearance at convenient moments. The letter went on to detail specific incidents that I remembered well, times when Frank had reached out to his family and been rebuffed or ignored. The birthday when Carol had declined his dinner invitation because she had tickets to a charity gala. The Christmas when David and Ryan had left early because they had more important parties to attend. The weekend when Frank had been in the hospital for chest pains, and Emma had been the only one to visit. I am not leaving my legacy to Emma to punish my blood relatives, the letter continued. I am leaving it to her, because she has already proven herself to be the kind of person who will use it wisely and compassionately. She understands the value of hard work, the importance of treating people with dignity, and the responsibility that comes with resources. Ryan made one last desperate attempt at protest. But she's not a Morrison. She doesn't understand the family legacy, the responsibility to carry on the name. Mr. Mitchell looked up from the letter with something that might have been amusement. Actually, Mr. Morrison addresses that concern as well. He returned to reading. The Morrison name will live on through the work Morrison Industries does in the world, not through blood relation. Emma has shown more understanding of my values and principles than my biological relatives ever have. She knows that success means building something meaningful, not just accumulating wealth. She understands that legacy is about what you contribute, not what you inherit. The final paragraph of the letter was devastating in its quiet finality. To Carol, David, and Ryan, I leave you the monetary gifts specified in my will, which I believe are more than generous given your level of investment in our relationships. I hope this experience will teach you something about the difference between family and blood relation, and about the importance of treating people with genuine love and respect rather than calculated self-interest. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Carol's ragged breathing. She looked like she wanted to argue further, but what could she say? Frank's letter had systematically demolished every claim they might make about deserving his inheritance more than I did. This is insane, she whispered finally. Frank has given everything we should have inherited to a complete stranger. Emma isn't a stranger, Mr. Mitchell said gently. According to everything Mr. Morrison wrote and told me over the years, she's the daughter he never had, and the family member he actually chose. David slammed his hand on the table. I don't care what Uncle Frank wrote in some emotional letter. This is still fraud. She manipulated him, isolated him from his real family, convinced him to change his will. We'll contest this. We'll fight it in court. Mr. Mitchell nodded calmly. You certainly have that right, though I should warn you that Mr. Morrison anticipated that possibility as well. He provided extensive documentation of his decision-making process, including video recordings of our conversations about the will changes and testimony from several independent witnesses about his mental state and reasoning. Carol looked like she was about to explode again. Video recordings? Witnesses? What kind of elaborate scheme was Frank running? The kind that a smart businessman runs when he knows his family might not accept his decisions gracefully, Mr. Mitchell replied. Mr. Morrison was very thorough in protecting his choice to leave his estate to Miss Carter. Ryan had been growing more agitated throughout this entire exchange, and now he finally snapped. This is theft. Pure and simple theft. She stole our inheritance. I'd been quiet through most of this exchange, trying to process the magnitude of what was happening and the cruelty of their accusations. But Ryan's claim that I had somehow stolen what was rightfully theirs pushed me past my limit. I didn't steal anything, I said, my voice stronger and clearer than it had been all morning. Frank made this choice himself, based on 12 years of watching how all of us treated him. If you lost an inheritance you thought you deserved, maybe you should ask yourself why he felt Emma was more deserving. Carol whirled on me with renewed fury. You manipulative little snake. You wormed your way into his life, made him feel guilty about his real family, convinced him that we didn't care about him. I didn't have to convince him of anything, I replied. Your actions spoke for themselves. The truth of that statement hung in the air like a challenge none of them could meet. Because deep down, they all knew it was true. They had treated Frank like an ATM rather than a person, showing up when they needed something and disappearing when he needed them. David made one final, desperate attempt at intimidation. You think you can just walk in here and take everything our uncle worked for? You think you can handle running a company like Morrison Industries? You're nobody. You're nothing. You have no experience, no connections, no understanding of how business works. I looked at him steadily, feeling something shift inside me. For years, I'd allowed these people to make me feel small, unworthy, like an intruder in Frank's life. But Frank's letter had changed something fundamental. He had seen my worth when I couldn't see it myself. He had chosen me deliberately, thoughtfully, after years of careful observation. You're right, I said quietly. I don't have experience running a multi-million-dollar company, but I have something you don't have and never had. What's that? David sneered. Frank's respect, I replied, and his trust that I'll do the right thing with what he's given me. The silence that followed was absolute and final. There was nothing left for any of them to say, no argument that could overcome the simple truth of Frank's choice, and the detailed reasoning he'd provided for it. Carol gathered her purse with shaking hands, her face a mask of barely controlled rage. This isn't over, she hissed. We'll see what the courts have to say about this travesty. David and Ryan followed her lead, both of them shooting me looks of pure hatred as they prepared to leave. Actually, Mr. Mitchell said mildly, there is one more thing you should know before you go. They paused in the doorway, turning back with expressions of wary hope, as if he might be about to announce that this had all been some kind of elaborate mistake. The gifts that Mr. Morrison left to each of you in the original will, he continued, were also conditional on Miss Carter accepting her bequest gracefully. Since she has done so, you are entitled to your inheritances as stated. For a moment, they looked relieved, until the implications of his words sank in. However, he added, if you contest Miss Carter's inheritance or attempt to interfere with Mr. Morrison's wishes in any way, those gifts will be revoked and donated to charity instead. Carol's face went white. He can't do that. Actually, he can and did. It's all properly documented and legally binding. The three of them stood frozen in the doorway, clearly trying to calculate whether the potential gain from contesting my inheritance would be worth the certain loss of their guaranteed bequests. Finally, Carol turned and walked out without another word, her sons trailing behind her like lost puppies. The sound of their footsteps echoed down the hallway until the elevator doors closed, leaving Mr. Mitchell and me alone in the suddenly peaceful conference room. I sat back down heavily, my legs feeling suddenly weak as the full impact of what had just happened began to sink in. Frank Morrison had left me everything. Not just money or property, but his entire life's work, his company, his legacy. And he'd done it because he believed I was the right person to carry it forward. Miss Carter, Mr. Mitchell said gently, are you all right? I looked up at him, this kind man who had just delivered news that would change my life forever, and realized I was crying. Not from sadness, but from a mixture of grief, gratitude, and overwhelming responsibility. I don't know how to run a company, I whispered. Mr. Mitchell smiled, the first genuinely warm expression I'd seen from him all morning. Miss Carter, according to everything Mr. Morrison told me about you, you'll figure it out, and you won't be doing it alone. The company has an excellent management team, and Mr. Morrison left detailed instructions about the transition. He paused, then added, he also left one more letter, this one addressed specifically to you. Would you like me to read it, or would you prefer to read it privately? I thought about Frank, about all the conversations we'd had over the years, all the lessons he'd taught me, all the faith he'd shown in me even when I didn't believe in myself. I'd like to read it myself, I said, when I'm ready. Mr. Mitchell nodded and handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Frank's familiar handwriting. The sight of it made my heart ache with fresh loss, but also with something that felt like hope. I was Emma Carter, and apparently, I was about to inherit an empire. The silence in the conference room felt sacred after the chaos that had just erupted and departed. I sat alone at the massive mahogany table, holding Frank's final letter in hands that were surprisingly steady despite everything that had just transpired. The weight of the envelope seemed disproportionate to its actual mass, as if it contained not just words but the entire future Frank had envisioned for me. Mr. Mitchell had quietly excused himself to give me privacy, mentioning something about preparing additional paperwork and making some calls to Morrison Industries' board of directors. I appreciated his discretion. This moment felt too intimate, too profound to share with anyone else, even someone as kind and professional as Frank's longtime attorney. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished table surface. Downtown Denver hummed with life 15 floors below, completely unaware that in this small conference room, a 24-year-old woman was about to read words that would define the rest of her life. I turned the envelope over in my hands, studying Frank's familiar handwriting. He'd always written in blue ink with an old-fashioned fountain pen, claiming that anything worth writing was worth writing properly. My name was spelled out in his careful script. For Emma, my greatest pride and my chosen daughter. The words chosen daughter made my throat tighten with emotion. Frank had been many things to me over the years: mentor, father figure, cheerleader, and friend. But I'd never quite understood how he saw me until this moment. Not as an obligation or a charity case, as Carol and her sons had so cruelly suggested, but as someone he'd deliberately and lovingly chosen to be part of his family. I opened the envelope with careful reverence, unfolding several pages of Frank's distinctive handwriting. The letter was dated just 2 weeks before his death, meaning he'd written it knowing his time was limited, but with a clear mind and steady hand. "My dearest Emma," it began, and I could hear his voice in every word. "If you're reading this, then my final plan has worked exactly as I hoped. You've shown the grace and dignity I always knew you possessed, and you've inherited not just my business, but the responsibility I've been preparing you for your entire adult life." I paused, rereading that last sentence. Preparing me for my entire adult life? I thought back over our relationship, searching for signs I might have missed, clues that Frank had been grooming me for something bigger than I'd realized. "I know you're probably overwhelmed right now," the letter continued, "and wondering how a young woman with no formal business experience could possibly manage a company worth over $100 million. Let me ease your mind about something, Emma. You've been learning to run Morrison Industries for years without realizing it." Frank went on to detail conversations we'd had that I'd thought were just casual chats about his work. The time he'd asked my opinion about a new environmental initiative, and I'd suggested partnering with local schools to teach kids about sustainable building practices. That suggestion had become one of Morrison Industries' most successful community outreach programs. The evening when he'd mentioned a difficult employee situation, and I'd recommended approaching the person with empathy rather than discipline, advice that had turned a potential firing into a promotion and a loyal company advocate. Every Sunday dinner we shared, every weekend project we worked on together, every conversation about values and integrity and treating people fairly, all of it was preparation, Frank wrote. I wasn't just being a good mentor, Emma. I was training my successor. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. All those years when I'd thought Frank was simply being kind to an orphan girl, he'd actually been evaluating my character, testing my judgment, and quietly preparing me to take over his life's work. It wasn't manipulation or grooming in any negative sense. It was the patient, loving guidance of someone who saw potential in me that I'd never seen in myself. I chose you over my blood relatives not to hurt them, but because you understand something they never have. The letter continued. Business isn't just about profit margins and quarterly reports. It's about creating value in the world, treating employees like family, and building something that makes communities stronger. You've shown me time and again that you share these values, not because I taught them to you, but because they're already part of who you are. Frank detailed specific examples of my character that had convinced him I was the right choice. The time I'd used my Christmas money to buy groceries for a classmate whose family was struggling, without telling anyone about it until Frank accidentally found out months later. The way I'd defended a coworker at the diner who was being unfairly blamed for kitchen mistakes, even though it might have cost me my job. The afternoon I'd spent helping an elderly neighbor move furniture, simply because she'd mentioned needing help and had no one to ask. These aren't the actions of someone motivated by personal gain, Frank wrote. These are the actions of someone who understands that real success means lifting others up, not stepping on them to get ahead. This is why I trust you with my legacy, Emma. Not because of what you might become, but because of who you already are. The letter shifted tone as Frank began to outline practical aspects of my inheritance. Morrison Industries employed over 300 people across 5 different divisions: residential construction, commercial building, environmental consulting, sustainable materials development, and community outreach programs. The company's headquarters occupied an entire block in downtown Denver, with additional facilities in Fort Collins, Colorado Springs, and Grand Junction. I've left detailed transition plans with the senior management team, Frank explained. These are people I've worked with for years, people who share our vision and will help you learn the business operations. Don't feel like you have to prove yourself immediately, Emma. Take time to observe, to learn, to understand how each division contributes to our overall mission. He had also arranged for me to work with a business consultant specializing in leadership transitions, someone who'd helped other young inheritors navigate the complex challenges of suddenly running major companies. There were legal advisors, financial planners, and industry mentors, all standing ready to support me through the learning process. But remember, Frank cautioned, the most important decisions you'll make won't come from consultants or advisors. They'll come from your heart and your values. Trust your instincts, Emma. They've never led you wrong. The letter concluded with words that would stay with me for the rest of my life. I'm not giving you this company because I feel sorry for you, or because I want to punish my blood relatives. I'm giving it to you because you're the best person I know to carry it forward. You have the intelligence to understand complex business challenges, the integrity to make ethical decisions even when they're difficult, and the compassion to remember that behind every employee badge and customer contract is a real human being with hopes and dreams and families to support. Build something beautiful with what I'm leaving you, Emma. Not just profitable, but beautiful. Make Morrison Industries a place where people are proud to work, where customers know they're getting not just quality construction but ethical partnerships, where communities benefit from our presence rather than just tolerating it. I love you more than I ever told you while I was alive. You gave me the greatest gift an old man could receive, the knowledge that his life's work will continue in hands that will honor its original purpose while making it even better. Your proud father, Frank Morrison. I sat in that quiet conference room and cried for the man who'd shaped my entire life, who'd believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself, who'd trusted me with something precious beyond measure, but mixed with the grief was something else. Determination. Frank had spent 12 years preparing me for this moment, and I wasn't going to let him down. Mr. Mitchell returned quietly, carrying a fresh cup of coffee and a box of tissues. He sat both beside me without comment, understanding that I needed a moment to compose myself before we discussed practical next steps. He really planned all of this, didn't he? I asked when I could finally speak again. Mr. Mitchell nodded. For at least 5 years, according to his files, every major decision, every contingency, every potential legal challenge. Frank Morrison was nothing if not thorough. What happens now? Now, he said with a gentle smile, you become the CEO of Morrison Industries. The transition has already been approved by the board of directors, who were briefed on Frank's succession plan months ago. They're expecting you Monday morning for your first official meeting. The enormity of it hit me again. Monday morning, I would walk into a corporate headquarters. As the owner and chief executive of a company I'd only visited a handful of times as Frank's guest, I would be responsible for 300 employees, their families, their livelihoods, their futures. I don't know if I'm ready for this, I admitted. Frank thought you were, Mr. Mitchell replied. And in my experience, Frank Morrison was an excellent judge of character. Over the next several hours, Mr. Mitchell walked me through the immediate practical aspects of my inheritance. Bank accounts to be transferred, property deeds to be signed, corporate documents to be filed. The sheer volume of paperwork was overwhelming, but each signature brought me closer to the reality of what Frank had entrusted to me. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself thinking about Carol, David, and Ryan. Their anger and accusations had stung, but their complete shock at Frank's decision told me everything I needed to know about their relationship with him. They had genuinely believed that blood relation trumped everything else, that Frank's money and property belonged to them by birthright regardless of how they treated him. Frank's letter had made it clear that their inheritance wasn't punishment, but rather a reflection of what they'd actually invested in their relationship with him. $10,000 for Carol, $15,000 each for David and Ryan. Generous gifts by any normal standard, but modest compared to the value of Morrison Industries. They would have money to start over, to build something meaningful if they chose to. but they wouldn't inherit Frank's life's work without having earned it. I wondered if they would contest the will, despite Mr. Mitchell's warnings about losing even their modest bequests. Carol had certainly seemed angry enough to try, but anger wasn't the same as having legal grounds for a challenge. Frank had been meticulous in documenting his mental competency and his reasoning. Any judge would see immediately that this wasn't the impulsive decision of a confused elderly man, but the careful choice of a sharp businessman who'd spent years observing and evaluating potential successors. As the sun began to set over the Rocky Mountains, Mr. Mitchell and I finished the last of the immediate paperwork. I now officially owned Morrison Industries, along with Frank's house, his investment portfolio, and several other properties I hadn't even known about. On paper, I was worth more money than I could properly comprehend, but the number felt abstract, almost meaningless. What felt real was the responsibility. 300 people would be looking to me for leadership, vision, and stability. Clients would trust me to deliver quality construction services. The community would expect Morrison Industries to continue its environmental and social initiatives. Frank's legacy depended on my ability to learn, adapt, and lead. "There's one more thing," Mr. Mitchell said as we prepared to leave his office. "Frank left this for you to read when you got home tonight." He handed me another envelope, this one smaller, and marked simply, "For your first night as CEO." I smiled, recognizing Frank's tendency to think of everything. Even now, hours after learning about my inheritance, he was still taking care of me, still providing guidance for what came next. The drive home to my tiny studio apartment felt surreal. I was the same person who'd woken up that morning worried about making rent and student loan payments. But I was also now responsible for a business empire worth more than most small cities' annual budgets. The juxtaposition was almost laughable. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment, turned the key in the lock that always stuck a little, and stepped into the small space that had been my entire world just this morning. Everything looked exactly the same. The secondhand furniture, the dishes in the sink from breakfast, the textbooks stacked on my desk from the business courses I'd been taking at community college. But everything felt different, charged with possibility and weight. I made a cup of tea, settled into my one comfortable chair, and opened Frank's second letter. "Emma," it began, "by now you've had a few hours to process what's happened today. You're probably feeling overwhelmed, maybe frightened, possibly wondering if you've bitten off more than you can chew. These are normal reactions to sudden responsibility, and they're actually good signs. If you weren't feeling the weight of what I've entrusted to you, I'd be more worried." Frank went on to outline his vision for my first few months as CEO. I shouldn't try to make major changes immediately, but should spend time learning how each division operated, getting to know key employees, and understanding the company's current challenges and opportunities. He'd left detailed files about ongoing projects, upcoming bids, and strategic initiatives that were in various stages of development. "Remember," he wrote, "you're not inheriting a perfect company. Morrison Industries faces the same challenges as any business: competition, regulatory changes, economic uncertainty, technological evolution. Your job isn't to have all the answers immediately. Your job is to ask the right questions, listen to smart people, and make decisions based on our core values of integrity, quality, and community benefit." The letter included practical advice about everything from managing board meetings to handling media attention that would likely come with my unusual inheritance story. Frank had even anticipated that I might face skepticism from industry peers who would question whether someone my age could successfully run a major construction company. "Let your work speak for itself," he advised. "Some people will underestimate you because of your age and background. Use that to your advantage. While they're busy dismissing you, you'll be busy proving them wrong." Frank's final paragraph brought tears to my eyes again. "I want you to know that choosing you as my successor was the easiest decision I ever made. Not because you're perfect, but because you're the right person for this responsibility. You have the intelligence to learn what you don't know, the integrity to make hard decisions for the right reasons, and the heart to remember that business success means nothing if it doesn't make the world a better place. Sleep well tonight, my dear daughter. Tomorrow you begin building your own legacy." I folded the letter carefully and sat in my small apartment, looking out at the Denver skyline where lights were beginning to twinkle in office buildings and homes. Somewhere out there, Morrison Industries headquarters stood ready for my arrival on Monday morning. 300 employees would be depending on my leadership. Clients would be trusting my company with their projects and their dreams. For the first time since leaving Mr. Mitchell's office, I felt something other than overwhelming anxiety. I felt excitement. Frank had spent 12 years preparing me for this moment. 12 years teaching me not just about business, but about life, about values, about the difference between success and meaning. I thought about Carol, David, and Ryan, probably spending their evening cursing my name and plotting legal strategies that would ultimately fail. They saw Frank's decision as theft, as some elaborate scheme to deny them what they believed was rightfully theirs. But they were wrong about everything that mattered. Frank hadn't stolen anything from them. He'd simply recognized what they'd failed to understand. That inheritance isn't about blood relation or legal entitlement. It's about proving yourself worthy of someone's trust, about demonstrating the values and character that the giver wants to see continued. I had inherited more than Morrison Industries. I had inherited Frank's faith in me, his belief that I could carry forward something beautiful and meaningful, his confidence that I would honor his legacy while building my own. Monday morning couldn't come soon enough. I had an empire to run. 6 months had passed since that life-changing morning in Mr. Mitchell's conference room, and the Denver skyline looked different from the 32nd floor of Morrison Industries headquarters. What had once seemed like an impossible mountain to climb now felt like home, though I still kept Frank's old coffee mug on my desk as a daily reminder of the man who'd made this extraordinary journey possible. The executive suite that had once belonged to Frank Morrison had been transformed into something that reflected both his legacy and my own vision for the company's future. The traditional dark wood paneling remained, but I'd added touches that made the space feel more welcoming. Plants that brought life to the corners, artwork from local artists that celebrated Denver's creative community, and a seating area where employees felt comfortable sharing ideas rather than simply receiving orders. The transition hadn't been seamless. Those first few weeks had tested every ounce of determination I possessed. As I navigated board meetings where I was easily the youngest person in the room by at least 15 years, client presentations where I had to prove my competence before anyone would listen to my ideas, and industry events where skeptical competitors wondered aloud whether Frank Morrison's orphan protege could possibly understand the complexities of commercial construction. But Frank's preparation had been more thorough than even I had initially realized. Every challenge I faced, every difficult decision that landed on my desk, every crisis that threatened to overwhelm my inexperience, somehow connected to lessons he'd taught me during those Sunday afternoon conversations I'd thought were just casual family time. The senior management team that Frank had assembled over the years became my greatest asset during those early months. Margaret Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, had been Frank's head of operations for 8 years and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of every major project the company had undertaken. She became my mentor in the practical aspects of construction management, teaching me to read blueprints, understand building codes, and anticipate the 1,000 small problems that could derail even the most carefully planned project. James Rodriguez, the head of environmental consulting, helped me understand the technical aspects of sustainable building practices that had become Morrison Industries' signature specialty. Under his guidance, I learned about LEED certification requirements, green energy systems, and the emerging technologies that would shape the construction industry's future. More importantly, he showed me how environmental responsibility could be a competitive advantage rather than just a moral imperative. Sarah Williams, who managed the Community Outreach Division, became instrumental in helping me understand how Morrison Industries had built its reputation as more than just another construction company. The programs Frank had initiated, from providing apprenticeships for at-risk youth to partnering with local schools on environmental education, weren't just public relations gestures. They were integral to the company's identity and its standing in the Denver community. But the most challenging part of my new role wasn't learning the technical aspects of the business. It was handling the constant media attention that my unusual inheritance story had generated. Within a week of the will reading, local news outlets had picked up the story of the young woman who'd inherited a construction empire from her honorary uncle. The narrative was irresistible to journalists, poor orphan girl receives fairy tale inheritance after being mocked by greedy relatives. The attention wasn't entirely welcome. I'd agreed to one interview with the Denver Post, hoping to set the record straight about my relationship with Frank and my qualifications to run Morrison Industries. But that single interview had spawned dozens of follow-up stories, social media discussions, and even a segment on a national morning show that I'd declined to participate in. The constant scrutiny meant that every decision I made was analyzed and critiqued in public forums. When I approved a bid for a low-income housing project that would generate minimal profit but significant community benefit, some industry observers praised Morrison Industries' commitment to social responsibility. Others questioned whether I understood basic business principles or was simply trying to buy positive publicity. When I decided to expand the company's apprenticeship program and partner with Colorado State University to offer paid internships for engineering students, the move was alternately described as visionary workforce development and naive idealism that would drain company resources without generating adequate returns. The criticism stung, especially when it came from people who had never met Frank or understood his vision for what Morrison Industries could accomplish. But I learned to filter out the noise and focus on results rather than opinions. The company's financial performance during my first 6 months spoke louder than any media commentary. We'd completed 3 major commercial projects, ahead of schedule and under budget. The environmental consulting division had landed its largest contract ever, a partnership with the city of Boulder, to retrofit municipal buildings for improved energy efficiency. Most significantly, employee satisfaction surveys showed the highest ratings in company history, with workers at every level expressing confidence in Morrison Industries' direction under new leadership. The success hadn't gone unnoticed by Carol, David, and Ryan, who had indeed attempted to contest Frank's will despite Mr. Mitchell's warnings. Their legal challenge had lasted exactly 6 weeks before being dismissed by a judge who'd reviewed Frank's extensive documentation and found no grounds for questioning his mental competency or the validity of his decisions. The judge's ruling had been particularly harsh regarding their claims that I had somehow manipulated Frank into changing his will. The evidence showed clearly that Frank had been planning the transition for years, had consulted multiple advisors, and had documented his reasoning in exhaustive detail. If anything, the judge noted, Frank's decision appeared to be the carefully considered choice of a brilliant businessman, rather than the impulsive action of someone under undue influence. Carol had been ordered to pay court costs and legal fees, which apparently amounted to more than the $10,000 she'd inherited. David and Ryan had fared better financially, but were now essentially barred from any further legal challenges to Frank's estate. The 3 of them had effectively removed themselves from any possibility of future relationship with me or Morrison Industries. I might have felt sorry for them if not for what happened during the legal proceedings. Rather than accepting defeat gracefully, they had attempted to damage Morrison Industries' reputation by giving interviews to business publications that painted me as an unqualified fraud who would inevitably destroy Frank's legacy through incompetence and inexperience. Their strategy had backfired spectacularly when several major clients publicly defended Morrison Industries and praised the company's continued commitment to quality and innovation under my leadership. The negative publicity they'd hoped to generate instead became a rallying point for the construction community to support what many saw as an inspiring story of merit, triumphing over entitlement. But the real validation of Frank's choice came from sources that mattered more than legal rulings or media coverage. It came from employees like Marcus Thompson, a construction foreman who'd worked for Morrison Industries for 12 years and had been skeptical about taking orders from someone young enough to be his daughter. After our first job site meeting, where I'd listened to his concerns about a foundation problem and implemented his suggested solution, Marcus had become one of my strongest advocates. It came from clients like Dr. Jennifer Park, who'd hired Morrison Industries to build a new medical clinic and had been impressed not just by the quality of construction, but by the company's flexibility in accommodating design changes that would better serve the community's needs. Dr. Park had since recommended Morrison Industries to 3 other healthcare organizations, generating more than $2 million in new contracts. It came from community leaders like Reverend Michael Johnson, whose church had benefited from Morrison Industries' volunteer construction program. When critics questioned my commitment to Frank's community outreach initiatives, Reverend Johnson had written a letter to the Denver Post, detailing how the company's support had helped his congregation build a community center that now served as a food bank, tutoring center, and meeting space for neighborhood organizations. The most meaningful validation, however, came from an unexpected source. 3 months into my tenure as CEO, I'd received a handwritten letter from an elderly woman named Dorothy Martinez. She'd been Frank's elementary school teacher more than 60 years ago, and she'd followed his career with pride over the decades. Mrs. Martinez wrote that she'd been worried when she heard about Frank's death and the unconventional inheritance arrangement. She'd feared that his life's work might be dismantled or compromised by someone who didn't understand its true value. But after watching news coverage of Morrison Industries' continued success and reading about the company's expanding community programs, she wanted me to know that Frank would be proud of what I was accomplishing. I taught that boy when he was just 8 years old, she'd written, and even then I could see that he understood something special about bringing people together to build something bigger than themselves. From what I can see, he found exactly the right person to carry that vision forward. I'd framed that letter and hung it in my office next to a photo of Frank and me from my college graduation. Sometimes, during particularly challenging days, I would look at both reminders and feel Frank's presence guiding me through whatever crisis or opportunity had landed on my desk. The challenges were real and constant. The construction industry was notoriously difficult for women, especially young women in leadership positions. I'd learned to dress more conservatively than I might have preferred, to speak with extra authority in meetings where my competence was questioned, and to work twice as hard as my male counterparts to earn the same level of respect. But I'd also discovered advantages that Frank had probably anticipated. My youth meant I was more comfortable with new technologies that could improve efficiency and communication. My outsider perspective helped me identify inefficiencies and outdated practices that longtime industry veterans had stopped noticing. Most importantly, my personal story resonated with employees and clients who appreciated working with a company led by someone who understood struggle and appreciated opportunity. We'd implemented several innovations during my first months that had already begun generating positive results. A new project management software system had reduced communication errors and timeline confusion. An employee suggestion program had yielded dozens of cost-saving ideas and process improvements. Most significantly, we'd launched a partnership with local trade schools to create a pipeline of skilled workers who could grow with the company rather than being recruited from competitors. The financial results spoke for themselves. Morrison Industries had generated 12% more revenue in my first 6 months than in the comparable period the previous year. Profit margins had increased even more dramatically, thanks to improved efficiency and strategic project selection. The company's credit rating had been upgraded based on our strong performance and stable leadership transition. But the numbers, impressive as they were, weren't what made me proudest of what we'd accomplished. What mattered most was the culture we were building, the sense that Morrison Industries was more than just another construction company. We were creating opportunities for people who might not find them elsewhere, contributing to community development in ways that went beyond just putting up buildings, and proving that business success and social responsibility weren't mutually exclusive goals. The apprenticeship program had become a particular source of pride. We'd partnered with Denver Public Schools to offer construction training to students who weren't planning to attend college, providing them with valuable skills and potential career paths they might never have considered. 18 young people had completed the program's first semester, and 15 of them had been offered full-time positions with Morrison Industries or partner companies. One of those apprentices, a 19-year-old named Carlos Mendoza, had particularly impressed our training supervisors with his aptitude for electrical work. Carlos had grown up in the same neighborhood where I'd lived with my foster family, and his family had struggled with many of the same challenges I'd faced as a teenager. Seeing him discover a talent he'd never known he possessed, and watching his confidence grow as he mastered new skills, reminded me daily of why Frank's vision for Morrison Industries mattered so much. The environmental consulting division had also expanded beyond what Frank had probably imagined possible. Haynes Rodriguez had assembled a team of experts who were becoming recognized leaders in sustainable construction practices throughout the Rocky Mountain region. We'd been invited to consult on green building projects as far away as Phoenix and Salt Lake City, establishing Morrison Industries as a regional authority on environmental responsibility in construction. Our community outreach programs had evolved as well. The volunteer construction initiative that had helped Reverend Johnson's church build their community center had grown into a systematic partnership with nonprofit organizations throughout Denver. Morrison Industries employees could volunteer up to 8 hours per month on community projects, with the company covering their wages and providing materials at cost. The program had helped build or renovate 12 different community facilities in 6 months, from playground equipment at elementary schools to accessibility ramps at senior centers. But beyond the direct community benefit, the volunteer program had become one of our most effective employee retention and morale-building initiatives. Workers appreciated being part of a company that encouraged them to give back, and the shared experience of working on community projects had strengthened relationships across different departments and job classifications. As I sat in Frank's former office on a crisp October evening, reviewing quarterly reports that exceeded every projection we'd made, I thought about the conversation that had started this incredible journey. Frank had once told me that the most successful businesses were those that created value for everyone they touched: employees, customers, communities, and shareholders. Morrison Industries was proving that philosophy could work in practice. Our employees were earning more money and had better benefits than industry averages. Our customers were getting higher quality construction services at competitive prices. The communities where we worked were benefiting from our volunteer programs and environmental initiatives. And the company's financial performance was generating returns that would have impressed Frank's most profit-focused critics. I'd learned that inheriting an empire wasn't about suddenly becoming powerful or wealthy. It was about accepting responsibility for something bigger than yourself and working every day to prove yourself worthy of that trust. Frank hadn't just given me a company. He'd given me a platform to make a difference in people's lives and the freedom to build something meaningful rather than just profitable. The phone on my desk rang, interrupting my evening reflection. It was Margaret Chen, calling from a job site where one of our crews was working overtime to complete a project before the weekend. "Emma," she said, her voice filled with excitement, "you need to see this. The client just walked through the finished community center, and she's crying. Happy tears. She says it's more beautiful than anything she dared to imagine." The project Margaret was describing was one of our most challenging this year, converting an abandoned warehouse into a multi-purpose community center for a neighborhood that had been neglected by city development for decades. The client, a local nonprofit leader named Maria Santos, had worked for 3 years to secure funding for the project and had chosen Morrison Industries based on our reputation for community-focused construction. The building had required extensive environmental remediation, creative architectural solutions to work within a tight budget, and coordination with multiple community groups who would use the facility. It was exactly the kind of project that other companies might have declined as too complicated and insufficiently profitable. But it was also exactly the kind of project that embodied everything Frank had taught me about using business success to create positive change. The community center would serve as a job training facility, a child care center, a meeting space for local organizations, and a cultural venue for neighborhood events. Morrison Industries had built more than just a building. We'd helped create a catalyst for community development that would benefit hundreds of families for years to come. "Tell Maria I'll be there in 20 minutes, I told Margaret. "I want to see her reaction for myself." As I gathered my coat and keys, I thought about Frank and what he would have said about this moment. He'd probably have smiled that quiet, satisfied smile he wore when he was particularly proud of something, and reminded me that the best construction projects weren't just about putting up walls and roofs. They were about creating spaces where people could build better lives for themselves and their families. I drove through downtown Denver as the sun set behind the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that made the city look like something from a postcard. The streets were busy with people heading home from work, grabbing dinner with friends, or attending evening activities that would fill their weekend hours with connection and joy. Somewhere in this city, Carlos Mendoza was probably studying electrical diagrams in preparation for his next apprenticeship project. Dr. Jennifer Park was treating patients in the medical clinic Morrison Industries had built for her. Reverend Johnson was preparing for weekend services in the community center our volunteers had helped construct. And in a converted warehouse on the east side of the city, Maria Santos was walking through a space that would soon be filled with children learning new skills, adults seeking job training, and families gathering for celebrations and support during difficult times. Frank Morrison had built an empire, but not the kind that most people imagine when they hear that word. He'd built an empire of opportunity, of community connection, of positive change that rippled outward from every project and partnership. And now that empire was mine to steward and expand, to use as a platform for creating even more value in the lives of people who might never know Frank's name but would benefit from his vision. I pulled into the parking lot of the community center and saw Maria Santos standing in the doorway, her face illuminated by the warm light spilling out from the renovated space. She was indeed crying, just as Margaret had described, but her smile was radiant with joy and gratitude and hope for everything the building would make possible. As I walked toward her, I felt Frank's presence with me, his approval and pride in what we'd accomplished together. This was his legacy and mine now. The understanding that true wealth isn't measured in dollars or assets, but in the positive change you create in the world around you. The $3 bill that had started this incredible journey was still framed on my office wall, but it no longer represented humiliation or dismissal. It represented the moment when Frank's faith in me had been publicly declared, when his careful planning had finally been revealed, when the empire he'd built through integrity and vision had passed into hands he trusted to carry it forward. I was Emma Carter, CEO of Morrison Industries, and I was building something beautiful. 2 years had transformed everything, yet somehow the most important things remained exactly the same. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office, watching the Denver skyline stretch toward the mountains that had witnessed Frank Morrison's entire journey, from a young man with calloused hands and big dreams, to the visionary businessman whose legacy now lived through Morrison Industries' continued growth and impact. The view from the 32nd floor never got old, but today it held special significance. Tomorrow marked the 2nd anniversary of Frank's death, and also the day Morrison Industries would announce the largest community development project in company history. The timing wasn't coincidental. Frank had always believed that the best way to honor someone's memory was through meaningful action, and this project embodied everything he'd taught me about using business success to create lasting, positive change. The intercom on my desk buzzed softly, and my assistant's voice filled the office. "Emma, the mayor's office just called to confirm tomorrow's press conference. Channel 7 and the Denver Post will both be there, plus representatives from the Community Development Coalition." "Perfect. Thanks, Jessica. And remind me to review the financial projections one more time before I leave tonight." The project we'd announce tomorrow was ambitious beyond anything Morrison Industries had attempted before. In partnership with the City of Denver and 3 nonprofit organizations, we were launching a 5-year initiative to revitalize an entire neighborhood on the east side of the city. The plan included affordable housing, a community health clinic, a job training center, green spaces, and small business incubators designed to help local entrepreneurs build sustainable enterprises. The total investment would exceed $25 million, with Morrison Industries contributing both funding and construction services. It was the kind of project that would have made headlines, even without my unusual background story. But given the media attention that had followed my inheritance of the company, tomorrow's announcement would likely generate national coverage. More importantly, it would directly impact the lives of thousands of families who had been waiting years for the kind of comprehensive community investment that could break cycles of poverty and create opportunities for economic mobility. The project represented everything Frank had believed about the responsibility that came with business success, and implementing it successfully would be the most meaningful way I could think of to honor his memory. The phone rang, interrupting my contemplation. Margaret Chen's voice carried her usual mix of efficiency and warmth. "Emma, I just finished the walkthrough at the Riverside Elementary project. The principal is absolutely thrilled with the new library and computer lab. She wanted me to tell you that enrollment applications for next year are already up 30% because word is spreading about the improvements." Riverside Elementary had been one of our signature community projects this year, a complete renovation of a school that served one of Denver's most economically challenged neighborhoods. Morrison Industries had donated all labor costs and provided materials at cost, while our environmental consulting division had designed energy-efficient systems that would save the school district thousands of dollars annually in utility costs. But the project had meant more to me personally than any other we'd completed, because it reminded me so vividly of my own elementary school experience. I remembered being the kid whose clothes came from thrift stores, whose lunch came from the free meal program, whose field trip permission slips sometimes didn't get signed because my foster parents were too busy or distracted to pay attention. The renovated Riverside Elementary was now the kind of school where every child would feel valued and supported, where learning could happen in bright, modern classrooms, with up-to-date technology and resources. It was the kind of school I dreamed of attending when I was 8 years old, and struggling to keep up with classmates who had advantages I couldn't even imagine. Tell Principal Rodriguez that we'd love to visit again next month to see how the students are settling into the new spaces, I told Margaret. And remind her that our apprenticeship program is always looking for promising high school students who might be interested in construction trades. After hanging up, I returned to reviewing the presentation materials for tomorrow's press conference. The financial projections were impressive but not surprising. Morrison Industries had grown consistently over the past 2 years, with annual revenue increasing 43% and profit margins that exceeded industry averages by significant margins. More meaningfully, employee satisfaction surveys continued to show exceptional results. Turnover was lower than it had ever been in company history, workplace safety metrics were the best in our industry classification, and our benefits package had become a model that other construction companies were beginning to emulate. We had also received recognition that Frank would have appreciated deeply. The Colorado Business Hall of Fame had honored Morrison Industries as the state's outstanding small business, citing our combination of financial success and community impact. The Denver Chamber of Commerce had named us Employer of the Year for our innovative apprenticeship programs and volunteer initiatives. But the recognition that meant the most had come from an unexpected source. The Frank Morrison Memorial Foundation, established by his former employees with contributions from clients and community partners, had awarded Morrison Industries its first annual Legacy Award for demonstrating the values Frank had championed throughout his career. The ceremony had been held at the same community center where I'd met Maria Santos 2 years earlier, and it had been attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by Frank's vision and generosity. Former employees shared stories about Frank's mentorship and leadership. Community leaders talked about projects that had improved their neighborhoods. Young people who'd benefited from Morrison Industries' apprenticeship programs spoke about opportunities they'd never imagined possible. The most moving speech had come from Carlos Mendoza, the apprentice who'd discovered his talent for electrical work through our training program. Carlos was now a certified electrician working full-time for Morrison Industries, and he'd recently enrolled in evening classes at Community College of Denver to earn an associate degree in electrical engineering. "Mr. Morrison never met me," Carlos had said, standing at the podium with confidence that would have amazed anyone who'd known him as the shy teenager who'd started our program 2 years earlier. But his vision created the opportunity that changed my life. And Miss Carter has made sure that opportunity keeps growing for other young people who need what I needed. Someone to believe in them and give them a chance to prove what they could do. The foundation had also announced plans to fund scholarships for students pursuing careers in construction, environmental engineering, and community development. The scholarships would cover tuition, books, and living expenses for recipients who committed to working for 3 years with companies or organizations dedicated to community benefit rather than pure profit maximization. It was exactly the kind of initiative Frank would have designed himself, focused on creating long-term positive change rather than short-term recognition. The fact that his former colleagues and community partners had organized it independently, without any involvement from Morrison Industries, showed how deeply his values had resonated with people whose lives he'd touched. As evening settled over downtown Denver, I found myself thinking about Carol, David, and Ryan Morrison. Their failed legal challenge had effectively ended their connection to Frank's legacy, but I occasionally heard updates about their lives through the small network of people who'd known the family for years. Carol had moved to Scottsdale, Arizona, where she'd used her modest inheritance to buy a small condo and settle into a retirement that seemed focused primarily on golf, and complaining about the younger generation's lack of respect for traditional values. According to mutual acquaintances, she still occasionally made bitter comments about Frank's betrayal of his own family, but most people had stopped listening to her grievances. David had taken a sales job with a luxury car dealership in Dallas, apparently hoping to start fresh in a city where his family name wouldn't be associated with the embarrassing inheritance dispute. His social media posts suggested he was doing reasonably well financially, but there was a hollowness to his online persona that hinted at ongoing resentment about opportunities he felt he'd been denied. Ryan had perhaps fared the best of the three, using his $15,000 inheritance as seed money for a small digital marketing consultancy that served local restaurants and retail businesses. His company was apparently successful enough to support a modest lifestyle, and he'd even married recently, according to a wedding announcement that had appeared in the Denver Post-Society section. I felt no satisfaction in their struggles, but also no sympathy for the choices that had led to their current circumstances. Frank had given each of them exactly what their relationship with him had earned, and their inability to accept that reality had cost them any chance of maintaining even a peripheral connection to his legacy. More importantly, their absence had allowed Morrison Industries to grow and evolve without the constant distraction of family drama or claims about rightful inheritance. The company's success had been built on merit, hard work, and commitment to Frank's values, rather than on bloodline or legal entitlement. The intercom buzzed again, and Jessica's voice brought me back to the present moment. "Emma, there's someone here to see you. She says she knew Mr. Morrison and wanted to meet you before the anniversary tomorrow." "Of course, send her in." The woman who entered my office appeared to be in her 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes that seemed familiar somehow. She moved with the careful dignity of someone who'd lived through many decades of joy and loss, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd earned respect through years of meaningful work. "Miss Carter," she said, extending her hand with a warm smile, "I'm Dorothy Martinez. I wrote you a letter several months ago about Frank Morrison." I recognized her immediately as the elementary school teacher who'd taught Frank more than 60 years earlier and whose handwritten note had become one of my most treasured possessions. "Mrs. Martinez, please sit down. Your letter meant more to me than you could possibly know." She settled into one of the comfortable chairs I'd arranged in front of my desk, looking around the office with obvious approval. "Frank would be so proud of what you've done with this place. It feels warm and welcoming rather than intimidating." "Frank taught me that business should bring people together, rather than create barriers between them," I replied. "I try to make sure this office reflects that philosophy." Mrs. Martinez nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds exactly like something he would have said." Even as a child, Frank understood that leadership meant serving others rather than commanding them. She'd brought a small photo album with her, and she opened it carefully to reveal black and white pictures from Frank's elementary school years. There he was as an 8-year-old boy, grinning at the camera with the same warm smile I remembered from our Sunday afternoon conversations. "I kept track of all my students over the years," Mrs. Martinez explained. "But Frank was always special. Even in 3rd grade, he was organizing playground projects and helping classmates who were struggling with their lessons. I used to tell the other teachers that he would build something important someday." She turned the page to show a class photo where young Frank stood in the back row, one protective arm around a smaller boy who appeared to be crying. "That's Tommy Rodriguez, James Rodriguez's older brother." Tommy was being bullied by some 5th graders, and Frank appointed himself as Tommy's bodyguard. He never asked for recognition or reward. He just saw someone who needed help and provided it. The story explained so much about Frank's character and his decision to step in when I'd needed help as a 12-year-old orphan. It also explained his close relationship with James Rodriguez, our environmental consulting director, whose family had apparently been connected to Frank's for more than half a century. "Mrs. Martinez," I said, "would you be willing to speak at tomorrow's press conference? I think people would love to hear about Frank's character from someone who knew him so well for so long." Her eyes lit up with pleasure. I would be honored to share what I remember about that remarkable boy and the even more remarkable man he became. As we continued talking, Mrs. Martinez shared stories about Frank's childhood that painted a picture of someone who'd been shaped by the same values he'd later passed on to me. His family had been working class, his father a carpenter and his mother a seamstress who took in extra work to help pay the bills. Frank had learned early that success meant hard work, that respect had to be earned, and that people with advantages had responsibilities to those without them. His parents were wonderful people, Mrs. Martinez recalled, but they worked so hard just to make ends meet that they didn't have much time for school involvement or extracurricular activities. Frank never complained, never made excuses, never felt sorry for himself. He just worked harder than everyone else and looked for ways to help people along the way. The parallels to my own childhood were striking and probably not coincidental. Frank had recognized something in my story that resonated with his own experience, and he'd responded with the same protective instinct that had made him defend Tommy Rodriguez on that elementary school playground decades earlier. Mrs. Martinez stayed for more than an hour, sharing memories and insights that helped me understand Frank's character in ways I'd never fully grasped before. When she finally prepared to leave, she pulled out one more photograph from her album. "This is from Frank's 8th grade graduation," she said, showing me a picture of a gangly teenager in an ill-fitting suit, beaming with pride as he received some kind of award. He won the Citizenship Award that year for his volunteer work with younger students. I remember thinking that this boy understood something important about using his talents to help others. She handed me the photograph with a gentle smile. "I think he'd want you to have this." It shows the moment when Frank Morrison first received public recognition for the values that would guide his entire life. I accepted the photograph with hands that trembled slightly from emotion. The teenage Frank in the picture looked so young and hopeful, already displaying the integrity and compassion that would eventually lead him to change my life in ways I was still discovering. After Mrs. Martinez left, I sat in my office as darkness fell over Denver, studying the photograph and thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. Tomorrow would mark 2 years since Frank's death, but in many ways, it felt like he'd never left. His presence was everywhere in Morrison Industries, from the company values that guided every major decision to the community programs that extended his vision of business as a force for positive change. The 5-year neighborhood revitalization project we'd announce tomorrow was ambitious, but it was also achievable because Frank had built Morrison Industries on foundations strong enough to support initiatives that went far beyond traditional construction work. The company's financial success gave us the resources to take risks and invest in long-term community benefit. Our reputation for integrity and quality attracted partners who shared our vision. Most importantly, our employee culture attracted people who understood that their work was about more than just building structures. I thought about Carlos Mendoza, who'd started as an uncertain teenager and was now a skilled electrician planning to become an engineer. I thought about Maria Santos, whose community center had become a hub of activity that was transforming her entire neighborhood. I thought about Principal Rodriguez, whose school was now attracting families who wanted their children to learn in an environment that valued every student. All of these success stories were connected to Frank's decision to see potential in a 12-year-old orphan girl and invest 12 years in preparing her to carry forward his life's work. But they were also connected to my decision to honor his trust by building something even bigger and more meaningful than what he'd left me. The $3 bill still hung framed on my office wall, but it was now surrounded by photographs, awards, and letters that told the story of Morrison Industries' growth under my leadership. The monetary amount that had once seemed like an insult had become a symbol of the character test that had changed everything. The moment when Frank's careful planning had been revealed, and his faith in me had been publicly declared. Tomorrow's press conference would generate significant media attention, but the real measure of success would come over the following 5 years. As the neighborhood revitalization project created opportunities, improved lives, and demonstrated once again that business could be a powerful force for positive change when guided by the right values and vision. As I prepared to leave the office, I paused at Frank's old desk to read the quote he'd kept framed there throughout his career. "Success is not measured by what you accomplish, but by the opposition you have encountered and the courage with which you have maintained the struggle against overwhelming odds." Frank had encountered plenty of opposition during his career, from competitors who couldn't understand his commitment to community benefit, from critics who questioned whether environmental responsibility was compatible with profitable construction, from family members who thought he was wasting money on charitable initiatives. But he'd maintained his struggle with unwavering courage, and his success had been measured not just in dollars but in lives changed and communities strengthened. Now that struggle was mine to continue, and tomorrow's announcement would mark the beginning of its most ambitious chapter yet. I was Emma Carter, CEO of Morrison Industries, daughter by choice to Frank Morrison, and guardian of a legacy that would continue growing for generations to come. The empire Frank had built was no longer just his. It was ours now, belonging to everyone whose lives had been touched by his vision and everyone who would benefit from its continued expansion. And tomorrow, the whole world would see what could be accomplished when someone chose merit over blood, character over entitlement, and love over obligation. Frank's greatest gift hadn't been Morrison Industries itself. It had been his faith that I could make it into something even better than he'd imagined possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.